Absolutely. So let's start with this. You were out of the game for a long time, at least politically, but you ran after a long career in public service, both in the Texas House and in the U.S. Congress. After many years off, you ran for the state house again in 2022. Tell us a little bit about why you did that.
Well, we were losing every fight in the legislature. We've been in the minority for 20 years. We haven't had the governorship since about 1994. And it just seemed to me that we had a crisis on our hands. Trump's forces were basically unchallenged in Texas. His crowd had invaded the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Only 11 months before I decided to file and run again. And I just thought it was time for experienced people to get off the sidelines and get back involved, for fear we might lose everything. And I think if we don't do anything, we could lose everything.
And not only did you come back to Austin, from what I've read in the reporting is that, you've kind of lit the proverbial fire under the proverbial ass of the minority party and got people interested in fighting again. What do you make of that characterization that I've read about you in many outlets now?
Well, I've tried to take the fight to the Republicans and encourage my colleagues in the Democratic caucus to work together to concentrate their efforts as one in opposition to portions of the Republican agenda that we could stop because they may require, for example, 100 votes, and we have 64 votes. So we ought to be able to work together to stop things that require 100 votes. And also to, when the Republicans are not united, to use our numbers to negotiate for parts of the progressive Democratic agenda that are important to us. But that's not been going on in spite of a lot of talk. And I thought my presence there might encourage that to begin to happen. There are some encouraging signs. I don't think that they're anywhere close to being sufficient, but somebody has to start talking that way. I want to emphasize there are many good members of the Democratic caucus that want to do that, but they're faced with a large group of people who have given up, who've decided to try to be players in a Republican majority House and to get by not being offensive and just hoping that they'll be allowed to pass a bill here or there. The problem with that is, and that does work, the problem is those bills don't amount to anything. And on the major issues that count the most, like how we spend our money, like public education, like property taxes, we lose entirely. And you can't keep on losing the war and claim that you're making progress because once in a while you win a battle.
Well, it looks like you and your colleagues might have another war on your hands here in about 5 days. Why is the governor calling y'all back to Austin? What's the purpose of this upcoming special session?
Well, the governor's calling us back in because he wants the legislature to pass a bill authorizing the use of public money to provide vouchers to be spent at private schools. And he's doing that even though we failed to fund public education in this last session. And in fact, in the last 10 years, independent school districts have not had an increase in funding. All the increase in education spending, which has not been dramatic, has gone to charter schools. So we are now 44th in the United States in our per pupil expenditures on public education from the state level. Texas is 49th in the share of its population over 25 years old that has a high school education. It's absurd and ridiculous for a state as wealthy as ours not to be fully funding public education. They do not want to do that. They want to privatize the school system They want us to begin a voucher program so that ultimately all education is private and they're able then to separate themselves off into their own schools and not have to go to school with children of other races or children that have any problems. They want to teach their own version of history and their own version of religion. Vouchers have a vile history. They began with the attempts by white people in the South to avoid integration, and every time vouchers have been brought up for the last 70 years, it's been an effort to allow certain groups of people to get off by themselves and not have to be part of our society.
And you raise a lot of interesting points there, but what I wonder, based on especially past interviews I've seen from you, will Democrats even have a chance to raise some of these points? Will Democrats even be in the conversation in this special session, or is it going to be a case of, Democrats kind of getting rolled over by House and Senate Republicans?
Well, we'll be in the we'll be heard. We'll be offering amendments. We'll be offering our own bill. We'll be heard, but we don't have enough votes to win the day all alone. We have to have some Republicans that go along with us or agree with us that vouchers are the first step toward totally undermining public education. There are 24 Republicans who have been against vouchers, principally from rural areas where they know that if somebody starts a private school in a small town, it's going to undermine the quality of education, both publicly and privately. And we're hoping that those members will hold strong and vote no on vouchers. What we're faced with is a governor who, for ideological reasons only, because there's no empirical data to back up this move for vouchers, we're faced with a governor who is now offering big pay raises for teachers, increases in school funding, all the things he should have done anyway, as in return for a vote for his voucher plan. And not only are nearly all of the Democrats opposed to that, the teacher groups who would benefit in the short term are opposed to it because they know they'll lose in the long term, as are the Texas Association of School Boards, Texas Association of School Superintendents, and others.
And for those that haven't been following this issue too closely, based on what you just said, would you say the governor is holding those two popular items, school funding and teacher raises, would you say he's kind of holding them hostage?
Yes, he is doing that, hoping that we'll trade for that. And anyone who analyzes it realizes you might get a short-term raise for the teachers, but the public school system would begin to unravel if that happened. You only have to look at the states that have done it to see what a mess has been created by it. It's all comes back to them wanting to be able to get off by themselves, teach their own version of history, and teach their own version of religion using public money.
And you've made a note of pointing out when Democrats have been weak in negotiations, but it seems nobody's weaker both in Austin and Washington these days than moderate Republicans. So when folks hear about these rural Republicans that might join with Democrats to kill some of this school choice stuff, and people are skeptical that these rural Republicans will actually, hold the line on some of those issues, I would just ask, well, what do you expect? Do you think the governor will ultimately get his way here?
Well, during the regular session, those Republican members that we were talking about did hold the line and did vote no on vouchers when we had a straight up vote on it. All we can do is hope that they'll continue to hold the line. I don't have any particular insight into what their thinking is today, except they're currently saying they're going to hold the line. I sure hope so.
And if Democrats are perhaps destined to lose this fight, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. How can Democrats lose this fight, going out on their shield, so to speak, losing with dignity, maybe perhaps using their bully pulpit to say what they would do in 2024 on public education? How could Democrats go down fighting, I guess, so to speak, if they're destined to go down on this issue?
Well, I don't want to go down. I want to win this thing. And so I don't want to, I mean, there's no graceful way to lose. You just have to try hard to win. I do want the public to see us trying hard. Now, that's part of the folly of the way it's come to be done in the last 20 years, is that the public doesn't even see the Democrats fighting. And let me emphasize, you can't just get up every time they bring up something real bad, like repealing all of our efforts at the university level to try to have diversity and equity and inclusion in student bodies and in faculties and all that. You can't just wait until that comes along and get up and make a speech knowing they're going to win anyway and congratulate yourself that you're fighting back, because you knew going in you were going to lose. They have 86 votes. We have 64. What you have to do is work together to fight them on the big issues. You can't go along to get along on the appropriations bill. You've got to try to amend it, and you got to vote against it, and hope that if they come to the point they need your votes, then you'll be able to negotiate some Democratic priorities. You can't go on to get along on their tax proposal. Their tax proposal, which passed in the last special session, gave $3.8 billion in tax relief to refineries and skyscrapers. We could have taken that money and doubled the amount of tax relief given to homeowners. But a huge number of our members went along with the Republicans and passed that tax bill that was not fair to our guys and left renters, who are nearly 40% of all households, out entirely. They were just ignored and uncompensated. So,
and of course, I've read even about the Democrats that are close to Republican leadership, or at least one scolding you for being too aggressive and, prosecuting the case against some of these Republican policies. So I guess, do you expect all of your Democratic members, all 64, to stand resolutely against the governor's school choice plan?
No, I think we have some wobbly Democrats that we're working on, hoping to get them in line, but we can't count on all of them. I do think typically we can count on 51 to 54 of our 64 Democrats. The other 10 are up in the air.
And one thing I hear, just to present, I suppose, the Republican counterpoint on this issue of school choice, is they might say, what would you say to Texans, to parents who live in a failing school district? Down here, I'm in San Antonio, we have Edgewood, and maybe these parents aren't political, but they just want their children to go to a good school, and maybe they might look into charters. What would be the Democratic counterpoint to that argument?
Well, I think their concerns are well placed. The solution to their concern is to give Edgewood an increase in funding, which it hasn't had for 10 years, in spite of all this inflation, would be to pay teachers a wage competitive with the rest of the nation, to provide special education funding, which we're providing a deficit of $2 billion in that area right now. Public schools work. They're the most successful social program in history. They work well, but they don't work if you refuse to fund them. And they have not been funded. In fact, Instead of funding them, they've tried to privatize them by encouraging the development of charter schools and now by pushing vouchers.
And so it sounds like that might be summed up as Republicans started this fire by not funding public schools, and now they want to gut these schools because they're not performing. Is that kind of the case?
Yes, they create the case that public schools aren't performing by not giving them any money, and then come along and say, "Oh, we're going to solve it by privatizing everything and providing vouchers." It's very plain what their objectives are. I mean, anybody with any common sense can see what they're doing. The Texas Education Agency, its budget has increased by 40%, but it hasn't been distributing more money to their 1,200 school districts. So what is it doing with that money, with that big budget increase? Well, they took over the Houston School District here a few months ago, even though it was beginning to do better. They have threatened to others. It's all a matter of control and privatization.
And as I start to wrap this up, you, of course, were named one of the 10 best legislators in Texas by Texas Monthly. You know, you've been profiled in a few different local and state publications. But you say what you're doing is what a minority party should be doing. I think the quote is, "What I was doing was just adequate." So I guess speak to that. If what you're doing is just adequate, then what were Democrats doing, you know, before in the last 10 to 20 years or the last generation or so?
What I meant by saying what I was doing was simply what should be expected of Democratic leaders who've been elected to represent their constituencies. Ask questions in committee. You know, I was dumbfounded to see how many times we had hearings in which, if I hadn't asked a question, none would have been asked. In Congress, nobody sits there quietly. Everybody asks a question. In the legislature, before the last 20 years, I was there for 10 years. We asked questions and we worked hard to make sure that the progressive agenda was offered as an alternative in all legislation. That's what I'm talking about, being active. Instead, our Democrats had begun to adopt the strategy of trying to keep their head down, trying to be quiet, hoping that they might slip an amendment in here, pass a little bill there by not being troublesome, or by just totally collaborating with the Republican leadership, as about 10 of our members do. And then when that happens, they're able to pass anything they want to that doesn't conflict with the main Republican agenda. And that's what's going on, and that's what has to change. It's not going on in other states. It's going on here. We're a state of 30 million people. We're like a nation. We must have a legislature in which the minority party is robust and trying hard.
And I'll close with this one. And this one perhaps is going to come a little bit out of left field. One of the stories that I've seen that's kind of broken through with people that, you know, perhaps don't even follow politics is the corruption allegations against the New Jersey senator, Bob Menendez, and how he was, you know, hoarding cash for a rainy day. He had gold bars. Of course, in Texas, we have our own experience with a corrupt public official, as you know, some have characterized Ken Paxton. I guess I just wonder, as somebody who's been in the halls of power, both in Washington and in Austin for many years, how prevalent is corruption in our government? If a regular person could get a look behind the scenes at the state capitol in Austin or the nation's capital in DC, would they be horrified by what they see?
No, they would not be. There are 535 members of Congress, 100 senators, 435 House members. You're always going to have, in a group as large as that, somebody who's trying to cheat or misbehave. And that's the nature of things in a country with 330 million people. but it's, in my view, very rare. It's also very hard to get away with, as you can see. People have been caught and prosecuted before. In Texas, we have a special problem with it, and that is that Republican corruption goes unpunished. Ken Paxton's been under indictment for over 7 years and has still never been put to trial. Now he was, after that, was impeached, and an overwhelming case was presented against him, but all but 2 Republicans in the Senate refused to vote to convict him for fear of retribution from what I call the Republican billionaire caucus that weighed in on his side. The lieutenant governor presiding over this trial received $3 million in the month before the trial from billionaires that support Paxton. $3 million in campaign money. Didn't seem to think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I could go on and on. The corruption that we have is of our political system, in which there's no limit on campaign contributions. One guy who got rich, he was already rich, but he made another $2 billion off selling gas during the big freeze 2 years ago, then gave $1 million in campaign money to Governor Abbott. So, I mean, this goes on all the time. And these people have way too much power and influence, and it's because the Republicans continue to allow them to make unlimited campaign contributions, which ought to be limited by law.
And with that, that's State Representative John Bryant. Representative Bryant represents House District 114, which is anchored in downtown Dallas. Representative Bryant, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thanks very much.